Ready? Hello everyone, welcome back. This coming Shabbos is the Shabbos of the Addoma. We read about the red heifer and the mitzvah of purifying people who became impure through contact with the dead. It's also Parsha of Kitisa, and very often Para comes either in this Parsha or it comes next week in the next Parsha, which is also the Shabbos Mevarchim Nisan. Para always is read before Rosh Chodesh Nisan in preparation for Pesach. That's another story. So what is the Addoma all about? And it's interesting, what is its connection to Parshas Kitisa? So Parshas Kitisa has within it the story of the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, that we know that when Moshe was on Mount Sinai and the Jewish people were afraid that he wasn't going to come down, so they saw an image of Moshe on a cloud, and they frightened them, and they made a golden calf, which was an idol which was worshipped in Egypt. The Egyptians worshipped idols of animals, just like in India, where they worshipped the cow. So in Egypt, they worshipped animals as well. So they made this golden calf, and they worshipped it until Moshe came down from the mountain and destroyed the luchos, the tablets, and you know the whole story. So what is the connection between the golden calf on one hand in Parsha and the Addoma, the red heifer, in the Maftir that we read this Shabbos? Well, they're both cows, and they're both significant in that regard. However, the golden calf was made out of gold, which represents money and wealth and materialism and idolatry, while the red heifer represents purity, because by being sprinkled with the ashes of it, people became pure, and it was holy. And red represents blood, which is the life force of a person. So what is the connection? So many rabbis believe that the red heifer was an atonement for the golden calf. That how do we atone for our lust for money? Through acts of holiness and purity and doing mitzvahs. So they're definitely related. Let's talk a little bit about the idea of what they're all about, life and death. We know that the golden calf represented death, because idolatry is death. The separating from God is considered death, as it says, Atem hadvekim b'Hashem Elokechem Chaim kucham hayom. You who cling to the Lord your God are all alive today. That life is connected with God and Torah. And the opposite, death, is connected with the opposite of Torah, the opposite of life, obviously. So we find that in many cultures and many religions, they worship death. Death is a metaphor for Satanism, for hell, for all of these types of things. Death is considered in many respects a good thing. It is meritorious in many religions to martyr yourself, to give up your life for this holy cause. We find that in Christianity, the symbol of Christianity is the cross in which Jesus was crucified and killed in. And it's a horrible image if you think about it. An image of a human being nailed to a cross and dying a very painful death. You know, it's a very violent image. And Judaism, we don't have images like that. We don't emulate death. We find that to many radicalized Muslims, death, to become a shaheed, a martyr, a holy martyr, is considered a great thing. When they asked the mothers of many young children who were suicide bombers, who planted bombs in buses in Israel, what they thought about that, they said, I only wish that I had another son to give up as a martyr also, so that they'll all go to heaven. The idea of going to heaven and 72 virgins, and the ideal in Christianity, the ideal was to go to heaven. Why do we sacrifice ourselves? Why do we suffer so much in this world? And the answer is because we're going to have it better in heaven. We're going to have it better in heaven. That was the reward for suffering in this world. I remember one time I had a conversation with a Hare Krishnanik, who happened to be a Jewish boy from Brooklyn. And he was a member of the Hare Krishna, which is a very radical Hindu sect, not too common anymore, but it used to be common. And I asked him, why do you live a life of asceticism so much? You wear robes and you don't marry, many of them don't marry, and you eat a very, very plain, simple life, foods, and you get up in the middle of the night and chant, and you live in an ashram and all of these. Why do you suffer so much and do not really enjoy the pleasures of this world so much? And he answered me, because when we die, we're going to go to heaven. And it's going to be wonderful over there. The image of these women, beautiful women in Hindu imagery of many different hands, extending out. Why do they have that? Because they can serve the men in many different ways with all the different, if they only have 2 hands, they can only serve them in a limited way. But if you have 4 or 5 hands or 6 hands, you can do a lot more stuff. So that's why. So they think that because they're going to suffer in this world, it's going to be better for them in the world to come. Jesus died for their sins. He didn't live for their sins. He died for their sins. And Muhammad, they emulate the day of his death. Our greatest person in history is Moses. And while we recognize the 7th of Adar as his Yortzeit, we also recognize that as his birthday. And a lot of people never heard of the 7th of Adar. It's not really a prominent day. It's not a big deal day like the Christians or the Muslims have for the death of their saviors, their prophets, or whatever it may be. Because Judaism does not emulate, does not glorify death. For us, death is a state of being. Of course, it happens. It's part of life, as they say, but it's not the ideal of life. In fact, when we go around in a cemetery, you're supposed to tuck in your tzitzit, because the dead are embarrassed when they see us walking around doing the mitzvah tzitzit, and they cannot do that anymore because they're dead, so it's an embarrassment to them, so we tuck in our tzitzis. We do not see that death is such a wonderful thing. In fact, we are supposed to cling to life as much as we can. Uvacharta choose life, our sages say. Our sages tell us that life is so precious that even when life is done very minimally, perhaps even without dignity, perhaps even in a very, very minimal state of being alive, it's still life. And life is precious, no matter how minimum it is or how limited it is, or how undignified it is. There's an idea of death with dignity, that people want to have euthanasia, they want to have mercy killings, because it is because a person in such pain or is uncomfortable is undignified, and they don't want to die in an undignified way. Judaism doesn't look at it that way. We look at it that life, any life, is precious, and we hold on to life until the very end, until the very, very end. And it's not something that we look forward to be dead, obviously, but it's something that we try to stay away from as much as possible. On the other hand, life is something which is very precious. And life, the whole time that a soul is inside of us, it is a gift from God. Even if a person seems to be unconscious, a person seems to be living at a very, very minimal level, but nevertheless, it's still life. And God breathed the breath of life into man and made him alive, as the Torah says. V'yipach bi'apav nishmas Chayim. God breathed into his life the soul, the breath of life. And in Hebrew, and neshima is a breath, and the word neshama is a soul. And a soul of a person is the very breath of God. When God breathed it into us, he gave us a nefesh elokah, a godly soul, and that godly soul is precious and pure and holy because it comes from God. And it's not something that we have any right to take away in any which way. You never find a Jewish soldier going into battle hoping they're going to die. And they try not to die in every respect. So, as I said, we do not have Jewish suicide bombers or Jewish kamikaze pilots. No such thing. We don't do something like that. It's not something we do. We don't see it. We don't see death with honor necessarily. Death is death. It's not a pleasant thing. It's not a good thing. Sometimes a person has to give up their life for God under three circumstances, namely if a person tells you to commit adultery or worship idols, to worship another religion, or to kill someone else. Certainly you give up your life rather than do that. But it's not ideal to do something like that. It really isn't. And unfortunately today we see child sacrifice all around in the Middle East and the Far East, where people literally give up their children, their beloved children, to God. And it's a horrible thing. And this is not something that we encourage. It's not something that we look forward to or something that we do. In fact, you don't find that Jewish mothers tell their children to go and become suicide bombers. You don't find that. Anyways, getting back to Parshas Para. So Parshas Para is the Paraduma was a red heifer, that it had to be red from head to toe. It could only have one non-red hair. If it had more than one non-red hair, it would be unusable for this purpose. There were only about 9 red heifers in history, and we know that when Mashiach comes, there will be another one, the final one. And the way it worked was that the Kohanim or the rabbis would come and inspect the cow to make sure that it was completely red, and then they slaughtered it according to the rules of Jewish slaughter, and then they burned it completely with every part of it, their insides, their outsides. They took the ashes from this red cow and they mixed it together with living waters, mayim chayim, living waters, water from a stream, from a pool that was moving, from the ocean or whatever it may be. And they would take these living waters and mix it together with the ashes. When someone became ritually impure, like having contact with the dead, they were sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer, and this returned them to a state of purity, or tahora, to be tahor again. So impurity is tuma, and purity is tahora. So how did it work? Why the red heifer? Well, we mentioned before the connection to the golden calf. Let's take a look. The Rabbi says in a Sikha that the idea of the red cow was a cow represented the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul within us. That how is it that a person comes to be steeped in impurity, unholiness? They do this through the medium of their animal soul, their animal inclination inside of them. That it is the animal soul which instructs us and teaches us and leads us to do things which are not right. And we, when we follow it, it says, Ein Adam Oisa Avera, a person does not do an Avera, Ela Shenichnas Ba Ruach Shtus, unless a spirit of foolishness comes into them. And where does this spirit of foolishness come from? It comes from the animal soul. Interestingly, one of the words for sin in Hebrew is Avera. And Avera comes from the word Avar, from the other side. It's a transgression. By going to the other side of holiness, then you will do sins. it's also called the Sitra Achra, the other side. So the other side of holiness is unholiness, impurity. And this is what leads us to do all sins. The animal inside of us, the physicality inside of us, the material aspect within ourselves, draws us into things that we should not be going into. Things which are the lusts of the body, the desires of the body, and this is what leads us to do things that are not right. So by burning it, we cleanse it of its impurity, and we reduce it to its basic essence, which is ash. We take then, why is it red? Because the red represents blood, which is the passion of the animal soul. The body is driven by its blood. The blood has in it the energy, the passion of the body. So we reduce that to its level of ashes by humbling it, and then we take living waters. And what is living waters? Torah. Torah is called Mayim Chayim. Water in Hasidic philosophy is an analogy for godliness. It goes from a high place in heaven to a low place down here on earth. That's how water flows, water moves. So water is a life-giving force that we cannot do without. Even though we can live without food for many days, we can't live without water for many days. So water represents Torah and mitzvot. So we take the water and we sprinkle it with the ashes, the essence of the body, and we have within it the power to purify. What is this saying? This is saying that the body itself, the animalistic inclination inside of us, altogether is not really that bad if it is used for a good purpose. However, if we use it for an improper purpose, then it is no good. Food, for example, is a wonderful thing. We all enjoy eating. We like to have a good steak from time to time. We like a nice hamantaschen we just had for Purim. We enjoy all of the holidays, have delicious foods associated with them. But when food is used in an improper way, either it is not kosher, or in Israel it is lacking the tithing process that is required for fruits and vegetables in Israel to take Maaser and Truma from the various tithes that were given to the Kohanim in days of old, or we do not say a blessing over the food we eat, or we do not say a blessing after the food, or we eat gluttonously, which we're all guilty of, obviously. We don't eat properly. We don't eat in moderation. We don't eat in a healthy way. Then the energy of the food which goes into the body becomes impure, and the bodily soul takes it in and converts the body into a negative force, a force of death, not a force of life. It's interesting that in the Talmud it says that besides people who are actually physically dead, there are two others that are considered dead. One is someone who is blind, and the other is someone who is poor. They're both considered like they're dead. Why? Why are they considered like that? It seems like a very disrespect to people who are blind or people who are poor. And the answer is that a person can be blind but can still see. He may not be able to have the physical power of sight, but he can see in many different ways. We know that people who are blind, many times they develop what's called a sixth sense, where they are able to discern things that regular people who are sighted cannot see, cannot discern. They can tell inflections in people's voices. They can sense the presence of people. They can hear things that other people cannot hear. Their other senses are strengthened to make up for their lack of sight. So a person can be blind, but can see in many other areas. That doesn't really make them blind. it's a gift from God in many respects that a person has. One of my favorite singers in the world is Andrea Bocelli, who is a magnificent singer. I once heard him sing here in San Diego, and it was an unbelievable experience. Bocelli is one of my favorite singers, completely blind. I don't know how long. It seems that he was blind his whole life, pretty much. But a remarkable individual with the most magnificent voice, and everyone fights to sing with him because of his such a beautiful voice. He doesn't read the music, obviously. He can't see the orchestra. He can't see his singing partners next to him. He cannot even see his audience, which I'm sure most singers would love to see their audience. He can't see the microphone he's singing into, but he can see so many other things because he has a finer tuned sense of his other senses, which is a remarkable thing. So in many respects, he's really not blind at all. Quite the contrary. He can hear better than we can. He can feel and touch better than we can. He can sense things better than we can. And similarly, someone who is poor. How is someone who is poor like a person who's dead? Doesn't seem very nice to say that. A person who's poor has their own problems to begin with. To call him dead in addition to that. So, our sages in Pirkei Avos say, Ezehu Ashir, who is a rich man? Hasameach bechelko, someone who is happy with what they have. In other words, you can be poor physically, but rich in so many other ways. In so many other ways. I often ask my wife, what is the greatest thing you have besides your children and your wonderful husband? And you know what she answers? She answers flush toilets, running water, indoor plumbing. This is the great, what? Sarah, don't you want a house in Beverly Hills? Don't you want to drive a Porsche or a Mercedes-Benz? Don't you want to have lots of money to spend in whatever way you want? Well, we spend it anyways, but without the money. But besides that, she says, no. Just having running water is such a blessing. And you would think about it. In olden days, they didn't have running water. Once we were in New York, and we took a tour of the Tenement Museum in the Lower East Side of New York. You should really go and see that. And to see how the immigrants to America, the early immigrants to America lived in the early 1900s was unbelievable. They had no toilets. They had no bathrooms in their apartments. These tenements were old, run-down apartments. They had no water, running water in these buildings early on. They had to go all the way downstairs, and sometimes they had 10, 12 floors upstairs. To go all the way, can you imagine in the middle of the night? Older people get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. You'd have to schlep all the way downstairs. And many times it was very cold. Freezing sometimes. You know how it gets in New York sometimes. But they would have to go there because they had no indoor plumbing. So indoor plumbing seems like such a silly thing to wish for. We all have it. But nevertheless, it's a tremendous blessing. Whatever we have, we bless God for it. If a person can be very rich, but at the same time be very poor, very unhappy, have no nachas from their children, always have problems with their home, with wherever they're living. Nothing is ever good enough for what they have. And that person is a very poor person, even though they might be, their bank account tells them that they're very rich, but they are very, very poor. And being very poor, they're like they're dead, because they cannot enjoy life. They cannot take any pleasure in life because of their poverty. They tell a story of Rabbi Zushia of Anipoli, one of the followers of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the successor of the Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi Zushia was one of the leading early Hasidic leaders and masters. Among them, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad movement, Rabbi Aaron Karliner, Rabbi Elimelech of Luzinsk, etc. So many of the greats that lived 200-300 years ago. Anyways, Rabbi Zushia was known to be an extremely, extremely poor person who lived really at the very edge, as they say. One time, a man came to the Maggid and said to the Maggid, he asked him a question. He said, how is it possible to be poor and to be happy at the same time? How can you be poor and be happy? Obviously, this man was not very happy, and he was poor. The Maggid said, well, you have to go and see my student, Zusha, and he will tell you how you can both be happy and poor at the same time. So he instructed him where Zusha lives, and off he went. He went out and he found a small hut. Literally, it wasn't even a house; it was a hut in the forest. And he knocked on the door, and Zusha answered the door. He said, "How can I help you, sir?" The man said, "Well, I just came from the Maggid." "Ooh," Zusha said, "You just came for the holy Maggid. Please come in." And Zusha put on his coat and put on his gartel, his sash around him, put his hat on, to hear the holy words of his teacher. And he said, "Tell me, what did the Maggid say to you?" And he said, "Well, I asked him, how is it possible to be poor and to be happy at the same time? And he told me to come to see you, and you would give me the answer." Zusha stroked his beard, and he thought for a moment, and he said, "My dear friend, I'm sorry, but I don't understand. Why did he send you to me? I'm not poor." The man looked around Zusha's house, and there he saw nothing. He saw a tree stump that served as a table. He saw a worn-out straw mattress that they used in those days on the floor. Other than that, there was no other furniture in the house. Maybe a beat-up old chair, and that was it. And he said, "It's amazing. This man says he's not poor? Of course he's poor." And the man understood, he is not poor because he's happy with what he's got. We live together in a time of unprecedented wealth. Not all of us live in fancy houses or mansions. Not all of us drive beautiful cars necessarily. But compare our life to 60 years ago, to 70 years ago, and our lives are infinitely better in every respect than our ancestors were, our parents' lives, our grandparents' lives. I remember growing up in my house in Toronto, and we lived in a very small house, a 2-story house that my parents bought after World War II. And my father served in the Canadian Army, and they had an opportunity to buy a house. How much did they pay for that house? Maybe $20,000, $30,000. And they paid it off. They had a mortgage on that house, and they lived. And my father first worked in a tailor shop, and then he worked in a store. And they got by, and they had one car, and it was not a fancy car, and that was life. I don't ever remember having to suffer from lack of food. Never. We always had plenty of food on the table. The house to us was a mansion. It was a small 3-bedroom house. Upstairs it had 3 small bedrooms and 1 bathroom in the hallway. And my parents did not have their own bathroom. Downstairs on the main floor, there was a small kitchen, a small living room, no bathroom. And there was a basement. Again, a very small basement with a small bathroom down there. And we rented out the basement to tenants to make some money to pay the mortgage. And we were very happy there, and very happy. Years later, I left to go to college, to go to yeshiva, and I came home for vacation, and I was shocked at how small our house was. I didn't realize how small it really, really was until I went away. And after that, we got married. We set up a home here in California, and we lived in nice homes. We had a large family. We needed many bedrooms, so we got larger homes. And for us, they were not fancy homes. They were very simple, plain homes, middle-class homes, as they say. And once a year, we would go back to Toronto to visit my parents. We take our many kids with us. And the house that we lived in back in Toronto was very, very small. And I didn't realize how small it really was. That the kids had to camp out in the living room and this room and that room. And we slept in a den, which was, they had a pull-out couch. And it was a very simple affair. But I never heard my parents complain. I never heard them ever say, we wish we had a larger house. We wish we had a nicer car. We wish we could have more money. And indeed, we had plenty. We had whatever we needed. It was more than we thought we could have. In fact, we enjoyed foods that today would be considered delicacies. We lived very comfortably in such a way. We were not poor, but we certainly weren't rich. But we were happy and satisfied with what we had. So death is really the absence of that happiness for what you have. Death is a form of spiritual destruction where a person is not alive, a person is not living. You need to be living in order to have a successful and to have a productive life. And how do you do that? Through a connection with the spiritual source. And the spiritual source is, for a Jew, Torah. Torah gives us a meaning. It gives us hope for the future. It tells us what our purpose is in this world. I was talking to a young lady recently who was not particularly observant. And I said to her, I think that eventually you're going to realize that life really has no meaning unless there is Torah involved with your life. Unless there is a spiritual component to life, you will not enjoy your life. You just won't have it. You need to have that spiritual component. We find very often that children who grew up in Orthodox homes, who left the fold for whatever reason, they felt it was too confining, or their parents might have been too strict, or they didn't get along with their siblings, or whatever it may be. And they go out and they sow their wild oats, as they say. And they go out and they have flings, and they go with non-Jews, and they eat non-kosher food, and they violate the Shabbos, and things like that. Eventually, they come back. Invariably, they come back. I have met them in many respects. I've met children who came from very, very prominent rabbinical homes who left the fold, and eventually they came back and they recognized. In fact, I remember two boys that I was in yeshiva with in New York, Bal Tshuvas. And these two guys one day picked up and left the yeshiva without warning. They had probably been planning it out for a while, but they decided this is not for them. This lifestyle is not for them. So they left, and one of them went into business, one of them went to college, and they ended up becoming totally non-religious. In fact, I heard a rumor that they celebrated their coming out with a lobster dinner on Yom Kippur. Can you imagine that? That's how they celebrated their coming out party. And everyone was shocked that they were so observant, they were so religious, they kept everything so much, and they completely left. Maybe they came into it too hard, too fast, for whatever reason. Years later, I found out what happened to them. I had a discussion with a colleague of mine, and he said, Rabbi Leider, in my community in Orange County, I have a man who is the foundation of our Chabad house. He is the foundation of our Chabad house. He opens the doors every morning, before I come even. He's the Gabbai. He is the Shamus. He's there for me whenever I need help. He's always there for me. And he says he knows you. He remembers you. And I said, who is he? He told me his name. I was shocked. Him? Yes. I told him what his background is. And he said, he's completely observant, totally observant. Unbelievable. What happened? He said, I don't exactly know. So that week, I got a phone call from this fellow. And my phone is ringing here. Let me turn the thing off. There we go. So he said, I got a phone call from this fellow. And he said to me, Moishe, remember me? I said, I can't believe it. What happened? He said, well, we were young. We were like in our very early 20s, maybe 20 years old. And it was too much for us. We grew up in completely non-religious homes, and we became religious very quickly, went off to yeshiva. The lifestyle was quite different than we were used to. We enjoyed it at first, but it got caught up with us. And eventually we just decided to leave. It was too much for us. But later on, after we got out, and we got married, and we settled down, we started having children, we started realizing that there's something really missing from our lives. A spiritual meaning, a sense of where we're from and where we're going, and the purpose of life and what it's all about. So I discovered my local Chabad house, and I started coming around, and one thing led to another, and I'm completely observant again. And I asked him, what about your friend? He said, well, my friend is having a bit more of a hard time of it, because he got married when he was not religious, and he said, on the other hand, I divorced my first wife, and I ended up marrying a girl who's religious. So I'm very happy. My friend, on the other hand, has a good marriage, but his wife is not interested in Judaism. She's Jewish, but she's really not interested. So he sneaks away from time to time. He does the best he can to put on tefillin in private, but he's having a much more difficult time of it. But he also is coming back, and eventually he will come back completely, and hopefully his family will as well. That's what happens, because we find that real life, true life, is only a life of meaning. And for a Jew, the only meaning of life is through Torah. And that's what the Addoma, that's what the red heifer teaches us, that we perhaps have sinned. Perhaps we've done many things that we regret, but we can always come back. Nowhere does it say that for many of these sins that you cannot be purified, even by coming into contact with death and with what death represents in this world. We can always be purified for it. We can always come back from it. God accepts our teshuvah always. And how is that teshuvah done? It's through the ashes of a cow that represents the animal soul within ourselves. That the animal soul yearns for godliness as well. The animal soul knows it has a partner, and that partner is the godly soul. So when it teams up with the godly soul, then you have a wonderful partnership that is terrific. When we eat, we do it in a holy way. When we walk in a holy way. When we sleep, we sleep in a holy way. All of our actions are done for the purpose of God and to sanctify God, and they have a sense of meaning to them. So I'd like to wish you all a good week. Next week is Shabbos Mevarchim, the Shabbos where we bless the new month of Nisan. We're all very excited. Pesach's coming very, very soon. We're going to talk about that next week. And it's also Shabbos HaChodesh next week, where we have the special Torah reading of HaChodesh Hazeh. And I want to wish you all a good Shabbos. All finished.
Cool.